but yeah, I mean, we've sort of gotten used to like, since we've been on Zoom all the time, like
Hmm.
looking forward is looking at someone almost like just from like a year of doing that. But yeah, anyway, we are now live. So hello everyone watching and welcome to the Gravity Max live stream. Today I'm joined by my cousin Ken, who is an architect. And so we're going to interview him about architecture. So thank you for being here today.
Oh, thank you to me.
Yeah.
I thought you were thanking your
Oh yeah.
guest.
Oh no.
Yeah, no, thanks for coming so
Uh,
that we can
that's,
interview.
that's a pleasure. I'm glad I'm here.
And I'm also joined by Sebastian, as
Of
always.
course, as
So
always.
yeah. So yeah, we're gonna have a fun episode. So first we're just gonna quickly go through just like social media links. So visit Gravity Max website, gravitymaxmedia.com. We have information about the show there. And then also our social media pages on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and Patreon, where you can get updates about if there is a show cancellation or like reminders about when we have a show and that sort of thing. Links in the description. Also, follow Sebastian on social media, 128 seconds Twitter and 128 seconds on YouTube. On YouTube, he makes short educational videos that are 2 minutes long, which are like the counterparts to these live streams where we like to talk for a long time. So the links to those are also in the description. And then finally, a somewhat odd start. My third book is on Amazon, and the link is in the description if you want to read that. So yeah, that all being said, our episode today is on architecture, and so we tried to make the title slide like a blueprint. But yeah.
It also meant that we could just slack on coming up with a creative video title for this one because we
Yeah,
just named
exactly.
it the base bare what the episode is.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about architecture, which, I mean, I think everyone knows, like, has some idea of what architecture is, but, you know, it's designing buildings and other structures. And there are, like, a ton of different factors that you have to take into account in architecture. And that's what we're going to talk about. So,
I remember when we were younger. I remember a lot of people wanted to be architects as kids. I can definitely see it. I can definitely see how it's very appealing to both, you know, a young child and then as you age going into like the profession as a whole, just because I think it kind of creates a bridge between your like creativity and what is physically there, and those are some of my favorite things on the planet. So, really excited to talk about this.
I'm curious. When I was a kid, not too many people thought about architecture. I thought, well, maybe I'll be an engineer because I like bridges, I like tunnels, I like structures. And architecture didn't occur to me. But that's not the case now. People think about it as a profession.
Yeah, 100%. There were a couple of required things that we had to do, especially around like middle school, where we had to put down like kind of what we thought our career would be, and that's a very strange thing to ask a middle schooler, I'd like to point out.
Yeah.
But they would ask us these things to fill out these surveys, like Max, you remember this, where they would try to like match
oh,
us with a
yeah.
career or something.
Yeah, they had like a program online where you would put in like what you like, what you don't like, and they would try to come up with like maybe this is a job that you would be interested in.
I remember a lot of kids going into that saying they wanted to be architects.
Yeah. Our friend Zach, who he's been on the live stream quite a few times as a guest, he is interested in art. I'm not sure if how much he's still interested in architecture, but he was really interested in architecture in the past.
Absolutely.
I haven't talked to him about it recently, but
I can. I had this idea. Well, maybe I'd be an engineer, and it wasn't until I started. It wasn't until I started applying to colleges, and I'd look at the courses that I have to take for different disciplines. And I was looking at the engineering courses, and it was, soil mechanics and chemistry and all this heavy duty science stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then I looked at what are the courses that the architects have to take, and it was drawing and sculpture and model making and and it all looked like play to me, like the kind of things I'd been doing as a kid. And that's when I realized, that's what I want to do. I don't want to be an engineer.
Yeah, interesting. But yeah, so we're gonna talk to you, Ken, for a bit. We're gonna have a little interview. We have some questions, and let's just get right into it. So first of all, we just want to let everyone know. So, like, where have you worked, and what were your jobs at these different places?
Yeah, I didn't have the normal career really. So I had this realization I wanted to study architecture. I had applied at that point there weren't that many architecture programs, so I applied to 3, and the one that I ended up going to was at Cornell University, and that's typical. The big choice you have to make early on in studying architecture is, are you going to study it as an undergraduate or as a graduate student? But there's really the only difference there is the amount of years it takes to get your architecture degree. And as an undergrad, usually the programs are longer than 4 years. My program was 5 years, but at the end of 5 years, I got a Bachelor of Architecture degree, and that's what I ended up doing. Your other alternative is and it's designed for people who haven't really made up their minds. You can go to undergrad and study anything you want, and then once you get your undergrad degree, maybe you're in liberal arts or art or whatever, then you can apply to a graduate program in architecture, and that's usually 2 or 3 years, but it's on top of the 4 years you've already put in. But you get a Master of Architecture, which really isn't any more training in architecture, but it does qualify you to teach architecture at the college level. So my Bachelor of Architecture degree was all I needed to be an architect, but if I wanted to be a professor of architecture at a university level, I'd have to have a Master's of Architecture. But that's for those listeners who were thinking about that as a career, that's your first decision that you have to make.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, how was the architectural program at Cornell? What did they have you doing? What kind of classes were you taking? Stuff like that.
Yeah. It's interesting. We're talking 50 years ago that I graduated from Cornell Architecture. So some things have changed radically in those 50 years. Some things haven't. The program, they were always very intense. They kind of throw you into the deep end of the pool, and you have to sink or swim. Mm-hmm. So you end up spending a lot of time, usually in a studio situation where a lot of all your classmates are working in one large room. You each have an area where you have your drafting board and your computer and your model making tools, and you're working there together as a group. So it's very intense, and because the process is, the essence of the process is they give you problems to solve, buildings to design, and you learn by trying to do it. At the same time, they're showing you examples of architecture. They're talking about the history of architecture. They're teaching you to draw. You can take sculpture courses where you're working with form, but the essence of it and the pass or fail, your ability to stay in the program, is that you pass these design courses in which you have to design buildings. But it was literally fun right from the beginning. I mean, it was just what I imagined. It was not engineering.
Mm-hmm.
There were art courses, there were sculpture courses, um, and there was design. There were structures courses, but where everyone is very concerned, am I good enough to be an architect? Do I know enough math? Are my calculus skills sufficient? We didn't need any of that. We didn't have to learn calculus ever in my architecture program. Our background in structures was adequate, gave you a good feel for that, but you never learned structures at the depth that an engineer.
It's really interesting.
Yeah, it's like I like that. I imagine it's very hands-on, like learning process.
Absolutely. And it's not. People are generally not very good at teaching it either, because you know, because it's very hard to describe what it is that happens when you design a building. Probably in this discussion, I'll end up trying to do that, but I didn't think my teachers were particularly good at it, and so it was a struggle. It was scary. And I think the reason it became such a time-consuming field of study was because you never knew what you were doing and whether you were doing it right. And so you'd work late into the night after night. When a presentation came due, typically, and I think it's still the case, me and all my classmates were working, 24 hours, 36 hours straight.
Wow.
No sleep at all.
Yeah, I can imagine it would be hard to teach just because, like, you can, like, there's some math things that you can say, like, oh, this material has this much, like, support, like, for this amount of weight. But it's kind of hard to convey a general sense of, like, style and design, like, creativity that comes along with just the mathematical, what does a building need?
Yeah, and this is, again, it's talking about my time, but it was the way architecture had been for hundreds of years before that. But I can try to give you an idea of it. One of the most boring parts about the process that they did insist on was to create what they called a program, okay? And a program was just a written document describing the problem. So in other words, they would give you the beginnings of the program, but it was all words. So it was going to say, let me think of a good example. We're going to design a retreat where writers come to stay for a week at a time, and they get all their meals in a group setting, and then they go off to a private space where they work on their writing. Okay, and here's the site, and it's in the woods. There's a stream. It's got this shape. The hills look like this, and there's going to be 12 writers there at any given time. They could be men, they could be women, they could be a mix of both. Their cabins will not have bathrooms or kitchens. There has to be a communal bathroom, a communal kitchen and dining hall. On and on and on and on. Just words, right? And you had to take those words and make that into a solution that was a complex of building.
Wow.
That was right. And so they'd give you the words, and they'd make it clear you better pay attention to all those words and do everything that is required. But then the rest, how do you get from those words to a set of buildings? They kind of just threw you in there, and you had to come up with a solution on your own.
That sounds incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
So you're there. You're working 24 hours, 36 hours at a time in all these stretches, and getting these difficult problems thrown at you. What would you say was the number one thing keeping you going through the architectural program?
Well, I mean, it was the people who signed up for architecture were always people who really wanted to do it.
Absolutely.
Right. So it was a love of the idea of making buildings, right? And so you wanted to do it, and then there was the fear of failure that kept you motivated. You didn't want to be the guy who did poorly and flunked out. And just this is not really important to your listeners, but to give you a little social context, at the time the Vietnam War was going on, and if you flunked out of college, you got drafted and sent to Vietnam.
That's a pretty good motivator.
Wow. Yeah.
It was the biggest motivator, and as another aside, they flunked many fewer people than they used to, because before the Vietnam War, they flunked someone if they weren't doing very good. Study something else. But because of the situation, the teachers really didn't want somebody getting drafted because they got a failing grade. So they were unusually lenient during those years.
Wow.
I was in college from 1965 to 1970. A feel.
Wow. Yeah, that's interesting.
The other part of the process that listeners should understand is, so they threw you into the deep end. You had to solve a problem, but the way they tried to help you was that you sat there at your drafting table. There were, at the time there were no computers, but that's irrelevant. Same process either way. And you had what was called a critic. You had a professor who would have a group of maybe 15 students, and 3 days a week you had to be in the studio working, and from 2 in the afternoon till 5 in the afternoon, and he would come around from desk to desk, look at what you were doing, and try to guide you. That was the process. It was a one-on-one process, and he'd look at what you were doing, try to figure out what there was there that was original to you, and then at the same time try to tell you what it was he knew that would make that into an actual solution.
So was this good preparation for working as an architect? Like this just sort of here's a paragraph of what you have to do, because I imagine that would be the sort of requests you would get as an architect from actual people saying here's what I want you to do. Is it a good way to prepare to be an architect?
Yeah. The short answer is yes. You had to carry on that process. So when you graduated, the client really didn't have an idea of what to ask. So the preparation of that program that I described that the professor would do, now I had to guide my clients through that process. I had to say to them, I would sit down with a pencil and paper in a meeting with them, and I would get them to talk and answer questions, and I would write the program. And that was incredibly strange, because the clients, they said, well, we want a house. Well, no, that's not the question. That's not the answer. And I'd say things like, what do you want that no one else wants? What do you want in a house that you've never seen before? Why aren't you just buying a house? Why do you want me to design a house? What do you need that's different than anybody else? What did you always dream about? What were your fantasies as a kid for a place to live. I'd ask, and also how many bedrooms, how many bathrooms. Um, do you want it to be bright? Do you want it to be dark and cozy? I just, and depending on what they say, I find more questions, and I drag a program out of them, and then we had a document that I could start using as the basis of a design. But going back to the process of learning, I remember. I'm trying to remember what year it was. It was my junior year. It was my third year. Mm-hmm. After 3 years of doing this, getting these problems and trying to solve them, I remember the first time that I actually understood what I was doing. Like I had this problem, and suddenly I came up with a solution, and I was amazed. It actually was a solution. It was the only form, the only shape, the only combination of rooms and stairs and relationships between spaces that solved the problem. And it was like, oh, there is a way to do this, and it was years before that happened again, because at that point it was just luck. But and by the time I graduated, I was only marginally capable of solving these problems. And it was only through doing it for many years afterwards that I got actually good at it.
Yeah, it's great, like, to get that sort of like when something clicks like that. Mm-hmm. It's the best feeling.
It's very much like mathematics, and right. That's what's kind of strange about it. It's a spatial thing, and they always say that people that have good math skills have good architecture design skills, and they also have good computer programming skills, because there's something similar about all those processes.
Interesting. So yeah, another question that we have, and we talked about this a bit before the stream, is how many architectural designs have you made? Yeah. Now, so you gave us your answer, but
I came right back. I said, how many podcasts have you done?
Yeah.
But you had a number, but you were vague. It's 50 years of practice. I've done hundreds of designs, and I've no idea whether it's 200 or 500, to tell you the truth. A lot of those were small projects, and that's why it's hard to keep track. Very often, because I focus on residential architecture, people would call me up and they just want to add something small to the house, or modify the internal layout of the house, and that would be a transformative project for that building. But most of my projects were that kind of scale, and that's why there's so many of them.
Yeah, that makes sense, because I mean, sometimes someone has just an empty plot of land and they want, like, build me a house, but then sometimes you have, like, I want to connect these two rooms, I want a new doorway, I want to add a room. So lots of different kinds of scales of projects.
But because I did so many modifications to existing buildings, and I think this is going to show up in your questions, that's why I never became attached to a style of architecture. Because I always worked in the style of the building that I was dealing with. I was already dealing with a building, So the problem I gave myself, and that I knew the client wanted too, but they never really aspired to it as much as I did. I wanted to take that building and make it better than it ever was. I didn't want to just say, they're adding a master bedroom suite. It's easy. I can add another bedroom and a bathroom and a big closet. That's not hard to do. I want to do that in a way that makes the entire building better, substantially better than it ever was before. So it always became a question of expanding on what was there. It's in architecture we call it contextualism. That that you're working with something, you're working in a context. You're not working with a blank piece of land, and so you're always adding to. You're not starting with nothing. And because I did so many hundreds of these little things, I got really good at that. And it became a theme that I would not touch. I had not solved the problem until I made the building better.
Right.
Not better because it was bigger.
Right.
Better because it was more beautiful, more aesthetically laid out, easier to use,
Yeah.
a whole range of things.
Would you say you preferred working in context than rather working just straight up from a blank slate, or is it the other way around?
I'd almost, because I got good at it, I almost preferred the context, yeah. But I found that I could, in many cases, a house is not, even a whole house on an empty plot of land, there's always a context. So the site became a context for me,
right.
So I wanted to make the site more beautiful than it had ever been, right? So a lot of builders say that with a negative context, which I shouldn't do, but a lot of amateurs will go to a site and the first thing they'll do is they'll level the ground. A lot easier to build if the ground is level. So they just come in with a bulldozer, and they knock down the hill and they spread it out in the other direction. They create a flat spot. I have never done that in my life. I would die before I would do that. Right? The context is the land, and the land is not going to be, almost never going to be flat, and that is a starting point right there. I'm not building on a flat piece of land, So how much is it sloping, and what does that mean for the building, So there was, and then there's the view. You guys had mentioned earlier about there's the orientation to the sun. So view, orientation. Where's the road? Where are you approaching from? Where do you want the bedroom windows to face? Do you want the sun to come right in the morning, or you want to not see it until noon? All kinds of things. Plenty of context. There's always plenty of context.
Yeah, that is very interesting because like certain house styles, I would say definitely work better in like different like biomes even. And sort of because like sometimes you'll see like you have a neighborhood where it's like all like wooden houses, and then like a new house pops up and it's like it's like a mini skyscraper, and it's like, why is this here? Like, it doesn't seem like it fits. So,
and that's exactly what I mean. If I was working in a neighborhood with other houses, I'd want to do something that brought out the style that was around and made it look like this was a place where this style was the norm, and I can, and if I could, something that I would add in the house I created that would make the other houses next to it look better. Right?
Yeah.
So you mentioned that you wanted to take into account like the aesthetics of a building. If you're building it, with the context, you wanted to improve the overall aesthetics and use like the natural context for any individual project. Are you more of the mind that architecture is more art or more just purely, I guess, functional, just a place for people to live or to work? Where do you, like, what percentage would you say it's art? What percentage is it just purely function?
Yeah, it's a good question. The function is essential.
Yeah.
I mean, if it doesn't work, you failed, you know. Right. But art is definitely a part of it, and but you know what that means is is hard to pin down. It's probably different for different architects. Um, one of the compliments I enjoyed the most that people would give me is, like I said, I didn't work in any particular style because I worked in the style of the building I was adding to, or I worked in the style that the client liked and enjoyed living in, right? And I felt I could do something beautiful no matter what style that meant. But people would say they can always recognize my building. And I was like, wow, you know? And I didn't even know that that was possible. But they recognized something that was the art, my art. And I don't even really know what that was. But I saw people do it, you know, over and over again. I'd have people walk up to me and say, I saw this new house. It's got to be yours, you know. And it was, you know.
That's
and
awesome.
It's like, well, why?
Yeah.
Yeah, all right.
Yeah, that's gotta be a great feeling.
That's the mark. That's the mark of a good artist, is when you can recognize them, even if they're working with different mediums, like doing completely different things, completely different pieces of art. If people can recognize that as the same artist, then that's the mark of a person that's very proficient in their field.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. And then, you know, like I said, it's certainly one of the nicest compliments I ever got.
Yeah.
So you know, but you know that's what your question raises there. That's interesting. Is I was never pursuing what you would classically think of as an artistic goal, right? Because everyone thinks, well, if I'm trying to make art, I'm going to have a style. I'm gonna be a modern architect. My building's gonna be steel and glass and white, you know. And I never did that, and yet it was art anyway. And so, you know, that leads to the classic about what it is to be an artist. It's to express yourself, you know, and whatever that may mean. And for me, a lot of it was in finding that functional solution that was aesthetically pleasing.
Right.
Right. And there's an art in that, and there's a well, I wouldn't call it a style in that, but there's a recognizable personality.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, you know because so the beauty of that is if you're an artist, you know, I have friends who are artists, who are painters and sculptors, and and the classic problem, every single one of them deals with this. They're painting away. They're making this painting. They're just trying to make themselves happy. You know, they're trying to express themselves. They're trying to make something beautiful. They're trying to say something, whatever they're doing, and they're just doing it for themselves. And then they find a gallery that shows the work, and you know, if they're lucky, it takes off, and suddenly people are buying it, and then suddenly people want that. You know, keep doing that. The gallery owner says, "I want more of those."
Yeah.
Right. And it's hell. It's living hell, because suddenly the process that they were living and breathing and it was working, they're told to stop that, just make another one.
Yeah.
And the temptation to make another one, especially if it's going to sell for a lot of money, is pretty great. But the act of being an artist is not doing that.
Right.
Yeah.
It's having that versatility and being able to not get stuck in one thing. Absolutely.
I've known more artists who have gotten good than artists who could stay good, because the pressure was so great of to stop being creative.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's
how would you say that you were able to accomplish what you have with staying good and being able to stay creative in your projects?
Yeah. Um, these are good questions because they really pull out the answers. um, the temptation that some of these artists fall into is the money.
Right.
It's the money, and I for again, it's complex. It's the complex social situation. Because I never got married, because I never had kids, I never had much in the way of financial responsibilities. And I really, money for myself, I wasn't particularly interested in buying stuff. All I wanted to do was design buildings that I liked. So, so I was able to stay true to my process because I wasn't pressured to make a living. Period. And how many people have that as an option? Very few. And I didn't choose it because I wanted to be free. I wasn't drawn to the responsibilities of marriage and fatherhood, and I enjoyed too much the freedom I had of being able to pick and choose. So I wasn't interested in the money, and that meant not only that I could pursue my art, but that I could reject clients. Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, no architect does that. I did that all the time. And I'd meet with a client, and I wasn't rejecting them. I was looking to see if I could give them what they wanted, if they were going to be happy with what I did, and if I was going to be happy doing what they wanted. And then if there was a fit, then I would take the job. If there wasn't a fit, I would recommend somebody who would be a better fit for them. But can you imagine, how your question, Sebastian, led right to this answer? Mm-hmm. I was able to do it by rejecting clients.
There you go.
Yeah, that's so interesting because it's almost like a paradox with artists, is that it seems that like the best artists always just get recognition after they've died, and I think that's because like they are just doing what is like theirs, like not for monetary gain. And so a lot of like the famous artists in history will be like not well off, and it's like, how is that possible? Like, how could, I can't think, like, I don't really know the specifics, but like maybe Van Gogh, I'm not sure if he lived well, but like,
yeah, Van Gogh did not live a great life.
Yeah, so you could say like, how did Van Gogh not like live well? And then it's like, well, it's kind of the answer is that great art doesn't necessarily make money immediately. And yeah,
that example is perfect, Max. He's the classic example. He did that painting because that was the direction his art took him, and nobody was buying it. Nobody at the time. His brother bought most of his paintings.
Wow. Yeah. So yeah, but that is what creates like lasting artistic expression.
Absolutely.
So so we've kind of addressed this, but what is the design process from start to finish? So if there's anything else you want to add about what it's like to design, any other aspects of the process.
Yeah. Let me. So like I said, the program is first, and that's boring. It's just boring. It's not creative. The whole idea with the program is to write the program without being creative, right? Just get it all down. You're not solving the problem. If you're trying to solve the problem at that point, you're starting too early. You don't even know what the problem is. So it's a essentially uncreative process. The next part of it was what we call the function diagram. So now you've got all these words, but you're not building words. So you need to somehow start to turn it into form, but in an abstract, easy way that's not challenging. So what you do is you go through the program and identify every space, every room, or area, and you find in the program how big that was supposed to be according to the clients. And you draw a box on a piece of paper that's that size, a rectangle of that size, and you do that for every space in the program, and you got a page with all these rectangles on it. Then you move them around to relate to each other in a way the program is asking that they relate. And with that primitive, stupid little task, you end up with a visual diagram that encompasses the problems of the program and could turn into an actual building. So that's step 2. Step 3 is the mystery process. It's the art. Somehow that function diagram, you start playing with it and suddenly magic starts to happen. And it turns into something in plan as an abstraction that works. Just works. Does everything the client wanted. And it's interesting. And and you can imagine turning it into something 3-dimensional. And it could be, and by the way, at that point, it has nothing to do with style. You start to create that floor plan that comes from that function diagram, and you could turn that into a building in any style you want, any style at all. So that's the next step, and then after you've massaged that plan, is what architects say. You've redrawn it, made it better, shown it to the clients. They say, hey, no, not that. I don't like that. That inspires something else. You change. And then you start thinking about the elevations and what this building's actually going to look like. But you can go very far towards creating the work of art with just the floor plan. And then at the second half of the process, turn it into a 3-dimensional object. And then there's the working drawing, which are after the design is done, you've got to turn that into a set of drawings that explain the process of how to build it to the building. So there's a good set of steps. Actually, I'll add one more, and then then the builder takes those documents and comes up with a price that could ruin the whole project right there. But if the price is something the client can afford, then you start building and you supervise the construction, and that's important. And I find that explaining during the process of construction what you had in mind, so the builder doesn't go off track, is a big part of it. And sometimes because of construction problems that are unexpected, or because of things you see while the building's being built, you'll come up with a new idea, and it might even change at that late date a little bit.
So, what would you say is the relationship between the architect and the builder? Do you personally like a more intimate relationship between the two, where you're maybe you physically meet up with them and you show them kind of your vision for the thing and explain specific details of it, or is it more like removed?
No, I like I'm sure there's a range. And again, it depends on your lifestyle. Mm-hmm. I live in Ithaca, New York, and it's a small town. It's a college town. And I want that direct link with the builder. And so I purposely then have not taken any job that is outside the county I live in, because I want to be able to drive to the job site every day and talk to the builder every day and see what's happening. And I like working with the same builders over and over again. Mm-hmm. I like them getting to know me getting to know them. Um, so it's a very cooperative interaction when it goes well, and it goes well if you have good builders and you've worked with over and over again.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like you become more cohesive as like a team when like both the builder and architect are like known quantities to each other. So yeah, that's cool.
One of the skills I developed over the years was, I'd go to the job site almost every day partly because it's thrilling. It's thrilling beyond belief just to watch the building get built that was in your head and was on paper.
Yeah.
Right. Because, it was in your head, then it was on paper, and it was pretty well described on paper. But it was tiny, and you were outside it.
Right.
Now you're in it. Right? You're in the thing that you imagine, and you're watching it get created. So I was there every day just for the thrill of that experience. But I love construction. I love wood frame construction, the way houses are typically built. It's a beautiful process where the exact same studs go together to make anything that you want to design. So partly I was just there to enjoy it.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Like imagination can like take you pretty far, but it's like there's something about physically being in a place and seeing it that just changes everything. Because I like to look at pictures of like landmarks and landscapes and stuff online, but it never really compares to like actually being there. Like I was recently in Colorado, and I got to like take some small hikes. We're not big hikers, we're not great at that, but we were able to like see like the physical structures of just like the nature, and it was like so amazing. And just like pictures just can't like fully describe it. So yeah.
And the other thing that you made me think of when I was thinking about dealing with builders, I got to a point where I did a lot of construction myself. That was one of the things that I know you wanted to ask about.
Right.
Early on, before my career got going and I was out of college, actually all through high school, I earned money over the summers doing construction work. So I was very familiar with carpentry. I developed, I drive out to my job sites every day, knowing I saw what they were doing yesterday, I know what they're going to be doing today. And I'd think, well, what could go wrong? What should I warn them about? And I would always know what mistake they were going to make before they made it, right? Because I just, I knew what I had done that wasn't normal. And I knew why I had deviated from the norm to do it, because there was something that I intended, that I wanted. But I knew they were going to assume that everything was normal and they were going to go off in this other direction. And I'd come and I'd usually catch them, before they did. And that was that intimacy of knowing these guys so well that I knew what they weren't going to do right. And I knew what they were going to do right.
Yeah. That's interesting. But yeah, so our next question pretty much relates to that. So how did you first become interested in architecture, and who were your inspirations?
Yeah. So I got there was a picture that I think you can bring up. Yeah, me at age 4.
Here, I'll put that up for everyone. Yep, it's up.
Okay. So that's the answer to how did I become interested. That's a toy that was very common in the 1950s and early 60s when I was a child. It was called American Plastic Bricks, and it was actually a precursor to Legos. Legos didn't exist at the time. And believe it or not, it was an American toy, made by a company in Chicago, and the name of the company was Elgo, ELGO. So I don't know how Lego came into being, but it clearly came into being because of these American plastic bricks. But you know what I wanted to say about that picture, the reason I pulled it out, when I got to architecture school, there were 60 people in my class, all freshmen at the same time, and 95% had played with building toys as children.
Wow.
I mean, and they were obsessed by them, you know. And at the time, there were very few, but you know, American plastic bricks, Lincoln logs, Tinker toys, one form or another, wood blocks. They all had spent substantial parts of their childhood building things with these objects, these small toys. So that's how I got interested.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, definitely early. Like, it's great when you get into something really early. Like that was me in like space. Just interested me since I was really really young. So.
Yeah. And you know it was amazing how much you could learn from these toys. You know there was only there was only like a half dozen shapes. They weren't like Legos are now. They were bricks. There was a full brick and a half brick, and there was a beam, a white beam, and there were windows. And you had to make everything with those same few pieces. But you could make anything with those same few pieces. You know, there was no limit other than the amount of bricks you had to what you could imagine. And so it was an incredible process of having at your fingertips something that you could transform your imagination into three-dimensional objects. And there was a second part to the question. I forgot what it was. Not just how you got started, but what was the other
if there were any like architects that inspired you.
Right. That's harder, I guess. You know, I was very aware of Frank Lloyd Wright, and he was certainly, you know, incredible. It's a funny thing about Frank Lloyd Wright is that he was so good, but his style was so personal. People shied away from it. Nobody wanted to. Very few people did buildings the way Frank Lloyd Wright did them, and I don't know quite why that was, because they were, you know, certainly a style that you could mimic. I think it's part of it was, but no one wanted to do it because they couldn't do it as well, you know. Yeah. And if you try to do it, you're going to look bad in comparison. But so I admired him, but I never tried to work in that style. There was a firm at the time when I was in college that I liked. They were called MLTW. It was the four partners: Moore, Linden, Turnbull, and Whitaker. And they were doing wood frame building out in California in a very contextual style. And that's why I admired them. And they were creating stuff the way I ended up working, where there was no obvious style at all. It was just what they did in wood, solving problems. So they did their most famous work was at a coastal development in California called Sea Ranch. If anyone online wants to.
I'll have to look that up.
But yeah, I didn't really follow in anyone's footsteps.
right. So next up, we have how does a person become an architect? But you've already answered that. So, like undergraduate program or
Oh,
graduate program.
I'll go the next step is that after you get out of school, you're not an architect. And matter of fact, like a doctor or a lawyer, you have to be licensed by the state, and so you have to pass a state licensing exam, and you can't take the exam until you've done an apprenticeship. So you have to work for a licensed architect for I believe it's about 3 years, and then you can take the exam. And if you pass the exam, then you can get your license. When I got out of college, all I wanted to do was houses, and at the time, you didn't need a license at all to design houses. A builder could design a house, or anybody, and so I didn't do an apprenticeship, and so I was never allowed to take the licensing exam, and so I never got a license, and so I never became an architect. And but over the years, the rules changed, and I wasn't allowed to do houses anymore. But there was always a way to get around it. So later on, I could work with an engineer, and the engineer stamped the working drawings, and that was okay. And so I always found a way to get by, but that was very unusual for somebody to not do the apprenticeship and get the license.
Interesting.
There's also, and I think it still exists, an option where you don't go to college, you don't get a degree, you just apprentice for like 10 years.
Wow.
And then you can take the exam and get a license. But those are the two ways to get an architect's license. By either getting a degree and doing a short apprenticeship and taking the exam, or doing a very long apprenticeship and taking the exam.
Yeah, that is interesting with the licenses. Was it like controversial, like when they started imposing the licenses, like for houses and stuff? Like at first, was that like, oh no, like upsetting or?
Yeah, it affected mostly builders. There weren't that many people in my position. Yeah, it was illegal, right? Because in fact, there weren't. Most builders were very competent, and there weren't problems with houses collapsing. This is what it's all about, really. But if something went wrong, you couldn't sue a builder. It was like, who's responsible for this? Was it the builder, or was it me, who told the builder to do something, or was it the homeowner who asked the builder to build this? It was all up in the air, and it was a legal dilemma. And so by creating a license, the licensed person is licensed by the state to do it right. And if he puts his stamp on it, and there's literally a rubber stamp that you get when you get your license, then he's legally responsible. And that was what they were trying to solve. And, it wasn't an unreasonable solution to a real problem.
Yeah, that's good then that it like sorted that out. Because that could be a major problem. So then our next question, do you have any hands-on experience with building? You've already said that you do. And then have you ever drawn up a design and then helped to build it yourself?
Yeah, I did, early on, right out of college. But I was a terrible builder. And so, that was like, and I was mostly, I wasn't unskilled, but I was slow, right? Suddenly I've got this attitude that I want every little bit of the drawing to be perfect. And now I'm out there on this job site, and it's not about, hammering every nail exactly right. You got to get this thing built, and it's got to happen fast. And I was way too slow, and I don't think I spent more than 6 months trying to do that when I realized that that doesn't work.
Yeah, I can imagine that, because you want to like really get the specifics right. Like you really want to make sure that it's like all to perfection. So that is interesting.
It still sounds like that that construction experience was pretty much invaluable, though, because it allowed you to have a deeper connection like with the builders, and allowed you to kind of speak in I guess, for lack of a better term, kind of a shorthand, because both of you have experience doing it. And when you can communicate ideas based on past experiences, you can get something done like 10 times as quickly.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. The experience was very important, and I certainly think anyone would benefit by it. And it, over and over again, job site, someone will say, what you want us to do here is harder, and I always knew exactly how hard it was, and I knew before they said it. I knew when I drew it, it was going to be a little bit harder, but I could say, yeah, it's a little harder, but not that hard. You can do it. And it was great to know that, I knew how hard it was. I could do it myself if I had, so.
Right.
Yeah. Right. That does remind me of music, of composing music, because sometimes you'll compose a song that sounds really good, but like no one can actually play it. Like I've sort of done that a few times, where I've like had just on the electronic software, like it'll play the sounds for you when you put the notes in, but then like it wouldn't actually be something that someone could play, because it's like on a piano, it's like it would have to be too many notes. And so it's like good to have that experience in mind of like, okay, wait, could I actually play this if I were to try to? So yeah.
Perfect analogy. Yeah.
So which of your past projects is your favorite? And we know that that's a hard question to ask, because people sort of ask that about our podcast, and that's kind of hard to ask. And then what aspect of that project was so memorable?
Yeah, it is a tough one. I know for sure that whatever I'm working on at the moment is my favorite in a way at the moment.
Absolutely.
I'm totally absorbed by it, right?
That's our answer too.
Yeah,
like
I was
what's your favorite episode.
Whenever
we
either of us,
like the most recent episode.
Because we always have that mindset of just constantly improving. Like if someone asks for something like specific, like if they want like quote unquote the best episode for history, we can like point to a specific one, but absolutely whatever one is the most recent one that we've done becomes our favorite, because we see the improvements that we've made between that and the last one we did, the one before that. So I'm glad to see that it's similar for your work, for your projects.
Yeah, because the one you're in the middle of is coming into being for the first time, and you're having that experience of creating it, and wondering what it's going to actually turn into. Yeah. But I didn't send you a picture, so I don't know how useful it is to talk about it. But that Warmest Driscoll edition, I call it, because we added 2 floors to existing one-story. That I'm still very fond of that. That was a really interesting project. It was interesting partly because it went through many stages of development. It changed radically. There were 3 or 4 versions, and they were all fascinating, and they were all very different. And then the one we built was unusual enough that I had no idea what it was feel like to see it and to be in it. So it actually had a form. You know, it's funny these days. Most of architecture has become invention of forms, which I think is a really bad idea. It's fine to invent a form that solves a problem, but to create a form just to create a form, you know, it's not a solution to anything. But on that Warmus Driscoll job, we invented a form. We had a pyramid-shaped roof that we wanted to look like a pyramid, and so it it was just a sloped roof, but it had 4 slopes that all met at a point because the building was square. Nothing that unusual, and we covered it with red shingles, so it had this pyramidal form and color. And then the question was, how do you get light into that space? Because it was a study, and there was a spectacular view from there. And I was working with a friend of mine. We were working on this project together. We were designing it together. And, you can put a dormer in a roof. That's done all the time. But the client said, no, I don't want a dormer. I want something more interesting than that. And we had we had drawn a window, and we were moving it around on tracing paper over sketches of the elevation of the building, and it slipped. And instead of being in the middle of the roof, it slid off to the edge, to the corner. And I remember that we literally just looked at each other and said, "My God, do you see that? You know, that window, if it's placed right at the corner, can be a window facing 2 directions, and then it could be a window where it intersects the roof on the other 2 sides, and it becomes a glass cube intersecting a solid pyramid." And right?
I really like that design.
Right, yeah. And it was an invention of a form that, by the way, I don't think you'll find anywhere else in the world. I've never seen it again. Mm-hmm. But it solved the problem of getting a lot of light into that pyramid shape, and it faced exactly where the view happened on that building. The view wasn't on the side; it was at the corner. That moment was that's what makes that building my favorite building.
That must have been incredibly satisfying to
exactly.
Found that perfect solution, and then it just solves every problem on your list.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
it's gotta feel great.
Yeah,
and I just love the open windows. Like, I just feel
Absolutely.
like huge, like, open window lighting. I love that. And like, this window is like, it's facing to the south, so that like the sun like gets in like better, like the sunlight gets in better. And so I just think it's like so cool, and then the view just from that one picture also looks just like great because it's over the water too. So it's like that just like great location as well.
Talking kind of about that, as non-architects, I can at least speak for me. The most architectural experience I have is Legos and driving around town and like looking at houses and being like, oh, that looks nice. Oh, that's cool. I like the garden. Like stuff like that. Like very, very basic things like that. Like around here, there are some really, really nice houses. There's some like gigantic houses. The architecture is not uniform, but it definitely has a certain style around here. Do you ever because of your architectural experience, I would imagine you're able to like look at a house and see little like tricks and little design choices and all of that went into the project. Can you ever kind of like get into the head of the architect if you're looking at a specific project?
Yeah. I got it. But you reminded me of something.
Mm-hmm.
There's two things that lead to becoming an architect: playing with construction toys and driving around Fairfield, Connecticut, looking at houses.
Absolutely.
Right. And when I went for my interview to try to get into Cornell University, and the professor interviewing me said, "Why are you interested in architecture?" I said, "Driving around Fairfield, looking at houses." So that's the other part of it. If you grow up in a place that's beautiful and has beautiful architecture, I think that pushes you in that direction. Do I recognize stuff? It's yeah. If it's somebody that I think is really good, then it's like, oh man, I can see into this guy's mind.
Right.
Yeah, amazing what he did. I don't think I could have done it, but now that he did it, I get it. I get it. The other thing though is like the houses, the little details. They seep in without recognition, and I think I think I'm still drawing things that I got from looking at those houses in Fairfield and not even knowing where I got it from.
The reason I asked specifically about like kind of getting into the mind, like noticing little design tips and tricks that like the average person just driving around Fairfield, Connecticut wouldn't really recognize, is because we mentioned him before, our friend Zach. He's been on the stream a lot. He is also very big into music. He himself is a composer, and he's been in the music world for pretty much his entire life. And as a composer, he will be able to listen to a piece of music and be able to like name the different like tips or the different like tricks that the composer is doing in the piece, that like the normal person, like I'm sitting there, I'm listening, I'm like, oh, it sounds nice. Zach can sit there and he can tell me exactly why it sounds nice. So I would imagine it's very similar if I look at a house down here in Fairfield County. And I say, hey, this house looks great. I'm sure you could sit there and tell me exactly why it's like visually appealing, why it's both, it has aesthetic value and has form value and all of that. It has functionality, all that kind of stuff. And I think that's one of the coolest thing that comes with being very adept in your specific field.
I'm sure it's the same as what Zach is describing, but my memory is not his. So I know I remember the tricks, but I don't remember where I saw them,
right?
Or when.
Right. Yeah.
It's good that you reminded me though about how I loved those houses were beautiful.
Absolutely.
And they inspired me. I wanted to be able to make houses like that. And that's why I stuck with houses and didn't get into larger structures.
Yeah. All right. So our next question is, what was the most difficult project you had to design, and what was so difficult about designing it?
Yeah. It probably was the Stoikov Miller house. I don't know how interesting this is. It was difficult because it was very complex. The site. I'm trying to figure out how to explain what I mean by complex.
If it helps, that actually kind of leads into our next question as well, about how it was that specific house was supposed to be based on Chinese architecture, if I'm remembering correctly. Did that play
Yes.
into its complexity?
Yeah, certainly. I had to learn a whole style of architecture that I wasn't familiar with or wasn't particularly interested in because the client was, and I found it aesthetically pleasing enough that I got into it. But I know how to describe this. I did well over 100 drawings for that project.
Wow.
Over 100 working drawings, not design drawings, working drawings.
Right.
Because I had to create everything. It wasn't just a wood frame building. It was a Chinese post and beam construction, and it wasn't a barn frame post and beam. The Chinese post and beam system was totally different, with all the posts being round and all the brackets being carved, and and I had to decide all those things, and how big each post was, and how it was unbelievably complex. And then I had to imagine a stair that went with that look, and railing, that went with that look, and I had to do details of every single thing that I imagined had to be understood and detailed and drawn up. So yeah, it was very, very. But I don't think of it as my best. Well, what else? The other thing about that project, I don't know why, it was incredibly God. Everything about it. The builder who did that job was a builder I've worked with many times. A group of guys, a company, and they said it was like a music box, like a little intricate set of gears and stuff, that a mechanical music box. Every piece had to be exactly what it was and fit exactly the way it went, and there was no room for any mistake or any deviation anywhere. And I did that house 20 years ago, and the people still live there, and they're very happy with it, and they're growing older, and they're having potential physical problems, and they came to me just this year and said, we might need an elevator in that building, which sure, and I've added elevators to other buildings, residential buildings. They make residential elevators, and they make very elegant ones that are nice to look at. I went back to the plans. I was like, "There's no way."
Yeah.
I couldn't believe I had designed a building. That's my strength, is I can add anything to anything. There was no way to do it. It was just like, I can't believe how impossible this is. So
Wow.
It was that tight. Everything was the best it could be. It was very hard to imagine altering it. So that was the most difficult.
Yeah.
Going off of going into like the second part of what that question was, is that a recurring thing that you see? Is that a common thing to see clients wanting like foreign architecture to be the basis, or at least kind of like an inspiration for a project that you're working on?
I try to phrase it so that their inclinations are not stylistic.
Right.
Right. So I'd rather they said something else other than Chinese or Tudor, or I don't mind them saying crafted out of wood. I don't mind them saying things like that. But it's not so. This is hard to convey, but this is important to me. And in learning about architecture, one of the things they did is they showed us They gave lectures in college where they showed slides of famous buildings, and that was 3 days a week for the whole 5 years, slide after slide after slide. You're not going to remember all that, and you're certainly not going to remember. Well, Zach might, the name of who the architect was and when it was built, but that all adds up into your head. It becomes a vocabulary that you do have some access to, and the ideas aren't. They look like they're style ideas, but they aren't. There's something else going on inside that style. So the plans of these Chinese house buildings that I looked at to design this were different than the plans of any building in the world. Okay, there was a way of organizing space that was cultural that you could learn, and it was applicable to anywhere. It was a way to solve some particular problems, and that's the case, that you want to study these buildings not because of their style, but because there's something universal in every one of them, in the floor plan of them, and maybe in the composition, but not particularly in the style.
Right.
So that's what's important, and I hope maybe there's a question coming up, maybe that we can get back to that.
All right.
Does that make any sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that kind of goes back to what I was saying about if you take a like a person that not in the architectural field, like me or Max, and we just like look at a house, what we think might be like a stylistic choice or something else, there might be something completely different at work. That style wasn't the initial it wasn't the initial purpose of whatever aspect of a project that we're looking at.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And like when you look at the styles of different countries, for instance, like say you're looking at like what is the style of like Norway, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the style would probably come from the fact that like there's going to be snow on the roof each year, like a significant amount, so you need to make sure that it like doesn't like weigh down, and there's probably going to be like actual like functionality things that we just like who aren't into like the architectural world look at as just like, oh, that's the style of that place, but it's actually like from the form of what's necessary to live in that place.
Yeah, that's it exactly. And I if I had when I'm designing for snow, and I'll look at those buildings to get help with solving this problem. I think let me just bend down for a second. Hang on. I made a little list of the pictures I sent you, and I want to see. This might be a moment to try to illustrate the idea that every period of architecture and every period of building is relevant throughout time.
Mm-hmm.
So, this is in terms of cities. Okay, people aren't designing cities anymore, and I think it's one of the great losses in the field. This desire to make monumental expressionist buildings that are sculptural and inventive, is not a way to make a city. You can't make a city out of just a whole bunch of those buildings. They don't go together in any way, and so that idea of contextualism is lost. But there was an architect named Paolo Soleri. He was from Italy, but he was an American architect. He practiced his whole life in the United States. He was a visionary who was trying to solve the problem of what a city should be, and and even though no one's done it, no one's designed a city in the last 50 years. One of the great losses was, I think, in China. There's so many cities that were built in China in the last 20 years for millions of people, and every one of them looks like I don't know, Detroit, or
Right.
Houston. I mean, like, why did they decide that a city should look like that? It's like, first of all, it's a autocratic country where I think the state, the government, was pretty much the client for these cities. It wasn't like some company wanted to build develop some land. The government wanted to develop the land. They said, let's put a city here, and then they built the whole city at one time. But no one designed it, or they designed it as though it was built by thousands of different developers with thousands of different architects, just putting up these ordinary American buildings, and connecting them with highways and streets. So can you bring up the picture of a trolley?
Sure.
That I sent?
All right, it's up.
Okay, so a trolley is a medieval village in Italy. It happens to be one of my favorite ones. Max, you were talking about, you can look at pictures, but boy, when you're there, and I've been there, and a friend of mine who's from Italy told me about a trolley. Not too many people know about it. He said he knew me and he said, I know you love those Italian towns that are all one building. He says, and the Italian town that is most perfectly one building is a trolley. Mm-hmm. And this is really the case. I mean, all those buildings are touching each other, right? There's no freestanding building anywhere in that picture. They're not only touching each other, they're on top of each other. And what used to be streets or pathways, because it was all pedestrian, are covered. They're not open to the sky because the buildings, as they grew throughout the years, covered every passageway. So it is one building, mm-hmm. and that's what intrigues me. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Now, is this a guide for what a city could be? Well, first of all, number one, historically, M.C. Escher, mm-hmm. The artist M.C. Escher, who makes those fantastic, right? When he was a young man, one of the first places he visited was a trolley, and he did drawings of it, and all that subsequent work was inspired by this one city. This is where he got the idea that a staircase could be, his things were constructions that went on forever, and you could not read them because the geometry was so complex. Mm-hmm. Okay, so now bring up, and if you can bring them up at the same time, the picture I labeled Paolo Soleri.
I might not be able to do them at the same time, but I can switch between them.
Well, yeah, whatever you think best there. I mean, I'm going to talk for a bit about the Paolo Soleri.
Right.
So is that up?
Yeah, that one is up right now.
Okay, so, first we're looking at a trolley, which is a medieval village in Italy, fishing village. And now we're looking at an imagined city that never got built, that Paolo Soleri imagined. And, Atrani informed this. I mean, the whole idea of Italian hill towns informed what Soleri created here, mm-hmm. but at a whole different scale. But the beauty of that village, the complexity of it, and the formal interest of it, is all expressed in this I'm trying to remember the term he used, but it's a mega city. It's a single building as city, right? And the Chinese could have done this. They could have created cities like we've never seen before. That would have been far more interesting than any city that's been created since the medieval cities. And of course he was Italian. He knew, I'm sure, just like MC Escher, Soleri was in Trani too. He had been there. He knew exactly what he was doing. And this is what I mean about style informing form and space at a level that is not stylistic. There's nothing medieval about the megacity that Soleri imagined. But formally, it's a direct descendant of that earlier form. And all of Soleri's imagined cities, he created many of them, were set into great physical landscapes. So he was using the physical landscape to inspire the form and to work off it, the way Trani does, and the way this example that's on the screen now. So, and if I want to explain to the novice that a Tudor floor plan can inspire a whole new idea of what a floor plan can be, this is what I mean. These kinds of concepts go on forever, and they're not about style, and they're not about creating a new shape. They're something much deeper than that.
Yeah, I find that really interesting because it reminds me of a sort of like sci-fi concept almost called an arcology, where it's like a giant building, and usually it's a self-sustaining building. So it's like the building has like, I don't know, like solar panels or wind farms or something like on top of it, and then like vertical farms like on the side or within it actually, that like allow it to be like 1 million people can live there and can actually like sustain themselves there, which is just like such a fascinating concept. And some of the proposals are like huge, massive buildings. I think there's this one called like the Exceed 4000, which is like a pyramid that is like kilometers wide and tall, that like all fits together to be a giant building. And that's just like, that would be so cool to just imagine like staring up at something that big.
That's perfect, Max, because when I was in college, Soleri, this was being done in the 60s and 70s, and Soleri was my best example. But now, the only place that this is being done is in science fiction, and I go there all the time to find examples, right? And they're great examples, and it's like, well, come on, guys, why is it only science fiction illustrators and writers that are doing this? Why didn't they do it in China? When they built a city for 10 million people in 2 years, they could have done it. And it's much more interesting. Yeah, I love those science fiction illustrations. I have a whole collection of them.
Oh, that's great.
Because it's to me, it's like that's where the architects are. They're the guys doing those illustrations because nobody else is doing it. Soleri's long dead. Those are the guys.
Yeah.
All right, so we can bring up the greenery in cities. I sent you 3 pictures. Because there was a question you were going to ask me because you gave me the list ahead of time. That's why I'm jumping ahead. What inspires me now? And, Soleri still inspires me. But in terms of things that I've seen recently, do you have, is like greenery number 1? Is that up?
That one is up right now.
And it's going to be one at a time?
Yeah.
One picture?
Yeah, you just tell me when you want to switch them.
Yeah. Here we go. I'm not Zach. I don't know who designed this. I don't know where it is, but it's a recent building. And, this is something I've noticed is happening. And, hey, this is the future, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and you know, all the starchitects that are supposedly hot don't get it. Now I know that this only happens in certain climates, and you know, it's very hard to do in cold climates. But in all these warm climates and all these wet climates, they're doing this. Buildings like this, they're just part of the natural environment, are transformed into part of the natural environment. This is along the lines of what the science fiction was leading to, that you exactly talked about, right?
Yeah.
And it's lovely. It's better than cities ever were, and it's a city, you know. And right? I mean, how hard is it? It's not that hard. I had a professor, Colin Rowe, who was actually one of my inspirations. He's long gone now too, but he was once listening to a lecture by one of these starchitects, Peter Eisenman. I might as well say who he was, and he got up at the end of the lecture and he said, "I don't know what this guy was talking about, you know." That made no sense to me, you know. He says, "It's not that hard. Architecture's not that hard, you know. Just do what they've always done that was beautiful, then do it again. Make it beautiful." So, you know, here's an example. I mean, this building never existed before, but hey, this is what it's about. Go to number 2, greenery number 2.
It's up there.
Okay. Again, I don't know what this is. I don't even know if this is real. If it might be, photoshopped. I don't know. Maybe it's real. Maybe it's not. Doesn't matter. You know, you know, and again, it's in science fiction all the time. Those cities on the waterfall, those cities in the river.
Right.
You know, Star Trek. You know, had all kinds of them. But why not? Why shouldn't the environment and the city be together?
I was really happy when I saw these images when Max forwarded them to me, because this is absolutely my favorite architectural choice in all of architecture. And also just in photography and art and just general aesthetics. I love nature coming together with like civilization with architecture. It is my absolute favorite trope. I have a lot of wallpapers up on my computer monitors, and it is full of just this. I don't think this exact picture is on there, but I wouldn't be surprised if it actually was. Like, it looks very similar to this. I'm a big nature guy and all of that, and I love seeing it be able to coexist with architecture. And like one might think that the two can't exist together, like they're mutually exclusive, but being able to see them like come together and all of that, and have them not like contrast too hard or any of that, have them just be for pure like aesthetic value, and as well, it's good for the environment and all that stuff. It's good all around. I was so excited when I saw those images.
Well, I'm excited that both of you expressed such strong feelings about this.
Absolutely.
So what does that tell us? Everybody wants this.
Yeah.
It can't just be the three of us, right? You build this, and people are gonna love it, but nobody builds it. Nobody does. It's not that hard.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. It is sort of
great. Go ahead.
I think it's kind of interesting that I would say like the sort of modern skyscrapers that we have now are probably what like 30 or 40 years ago people thought like, oh, that's really futuristic and like that's going to look really good. And like now that we have it, we're like, like the just like stark, it's kind of like it's just concrete and glass. And now like we really want the greenery mixed in. And so I think it's sort of like one day we probably will have that, because if you go back like 50 years ago, it's like the buildings that we have today might have seemed like, oh, could we really build that? So
I hope. So I've seen plenty of examples where the greenery, like in that first picture, is just covering the buildings. They can do it if the climate is.
Yeah.
I guess it might as well put up the third one.
Mm-hmm. It's up there.
Yeah. And again, my apologies to the architect. This is the home of a well-known Italian architect. He's in his later years, and probably, this is like his swan song. This is a house he did for himself, where he bought an old cement plant. Cement plants are these elaborate concrete structures with lots of towers and all kinds of things. And over the years, he renovated it into an incredible home with all this greenery around it, on it, part of it. And, it's not a city. It's just it's his home and his office. But it's a good example. And again, it's just what you said, Zach. It looks like it's from Star Wars, right? It looks like it's from science fiction. I mean, that's the other, but it's not.
Yeah.
It's there in Italy, right? And you could do this, no reason not to do this.
Yeah, I really like it. Just the sort of like nature taking back over like a steel or like a cement plant. It's just like sort of a fascinating like theme or message.
And who would get this perfectly is Frank Lloyd Wright. If he were alive now, this is exactly what he'd be doing. I can guarantee. His thing was organic architecture. How this thing that Sebastian was saying you want is this combination of nature and construction. That was Frank Lloyd Wright's goal, and he would be right there. He'd be doing these cities. Yeah.
And like we kind of saw on the last image, the Greenery in Cities #2, it looks to be in kind of an Asian setting. Like if this is really like it has like Asian characters on the side and all of that. That's one of the climates that I think this works the best in, just because of like temperatures and just volume of like vegetation and stuff. But that's also what kind of leads me to love Southeast Asian architecture, because it often has this just sheer amount of vegetation taking over the architecture, because partially because it's so old. There's structures there that are like thousands of years old, but it's the reason why I love this so much, and we have it included in our architectural examples later on, and it's just that's the number one reason why I love that stuff so much. It's this.
Have you
Go ahead.
Have you traveled there?
I have not, but it is definitely on my bucket list. I haven't been able to travel nearly as much as I want, but it is. I would say it's like near top 3 things on my bucket list is traveling to. I would say Thailand would be my country of choice for architecture, but I definitely want to work my way down there.
That's why I feel so bad about that moment of China building these instant cities is past. Mm-hmm. So the opportunity is gone. And I think it's also a lesson in human foolishness. It's like why didn't anybody see this as the opportunity that it? Why is it that humans just do the same thing over and over, and it takes a Frank Lloyd Wright or Paolo Soleri to imagine it, or a science fiction writer?
Right.
Yeah.
we're really not that bold as a species, and we're really not that clever. We tend to make the same mistakes over and over again.
Yeah, no, that does remind me, because I've been rereading this science fiction book that's my favorite book called Red Mars, and one of the characters is sort of involved in the architecture of building the new like cities on Mars, like when they first get there, and he says like, why should we like do the same thing we've always done on Earth? Let's try building something different. And then he actually does that, and so that is like exactly the like what you were saying right there. So
Yeah.
that's like
Yeah, and China, the charm about China is, well, first of all, a lot of those cities, I think almost all of them are in southern China, where the climate is like Sebastian said, is conducive to this. But it's that, they're not a capitalist country. They don't have to do these little monuments to each corporate headquarters. It's most inappropriate thing for them to do, and yet they did it.
It's a shame.
Yeah,
it really is.
How do you decide when this is over? How long do we go?
Well, yeah, I don't know. It's just whenever you want. But we could move on to the next few things we're going to talk about just on the different slides, because the last three questions have already sort of been answered just by the natural flow of the conversation, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
Unless there's anything else you wanted to add, just generally.
Yeah, because structure, I like structure. I know, Max, you're a writer, and they always talk about the arc of the story, right? Or the arc of the character in the story, and you want to see that. You want to see the person change and go through some kind of development. So the last picture I sent you was me now.
Mm-hmm.
Can you pull that up?
Yeah,
it's up there.
Okay, so there's a story behind this, right? So when I was 4, I loved my American plastic bricks, and the only limitation on what I could do was how many sets I had, and they were expensive. So about, I don't know, 5-6 years ago, I was on eBay and I typed in American plastic bricks, and everyone had them as a kid in the 50s. So now they're up in the attic, and every on eBay you could buy old sets. Everyone was selling their attic find of American plastic bricks. So, and they weren't that expensive. I mean, $20, $25, what the hell? So I bought a few sets, and I set them up on my dining room table, and I just started building something, and I built a little building, and then, because I had enough, I built 2 of those buildings, and I connected them with a little arcade, and I thought, I'll make a little courtyard, and over the next 3 years, okay, I kept buying more sets. And every time I bought more sets, I just added to what was already there. I had no idea where it was going. There was no plan. There was no design. It was just an accretive process of finding out what I could do with these toys, and fulfilling every fantasy I ever had as a 4-year-old. And this is where it is at the moment. But, some guy on the internet saw me that I was collecting these things, and he said, I've got, I don't know, 30 sets, and I'm just going to get rid of them. Would you want to buy them? And I said, no, I don't need any more, And he said, well, I wrote back, thanks, but no thanks. And he said, too late, I mailed them to you. So I I've got enough American plastic bricks to build Soleri's vision for the future.
Yeah.
and and that's where the story ends, right?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
That's great.
It's
I mean, that must feel so like nostalgic, just to like happy memories, like just to play with those.
It does. The feel of them is it's unbelievable. It's like a childhood dream, and the sound they make when they rustle together, and you're it's all from my childhood. Yeah. But if we're talking about architecture and we're talking about getting into the field, living through that experience, thinking about it in terms of all these things, I thought that was considering the first picture, this was
Yeah.
really the last.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah, that's good.
I
Thank
would
you for those.
Yeah, thank you so much. I would say, just as like kind of a final question for the interview section, I was wondering if the thought ever struck you, because if I ever went into the architectural field, I think this thought might like strike me, and I wanted to I was wondering what your take on this particular idea would be. If we're comparing architecture to art again, when someone makes a piece of art, the incentive to like keep it around, to keep it well preserved, is kind of dependent on how many people like it. If it's like famous, like if it's good enough to go into a museum, it's obviously going to be very, very well preserved. Or if it's like a loved family picture, it'll be preserved in that way. But when you make buildings and houses, it's people are inherently and intrinsically tied to those projects, so they will have that upkeep, that constant upkeep of wanting it to be preserved in that way. So I was wondering if the thought ever struck you of that, in doing these architectural projects, you're making very, very permanent art that has a much longer lifespan than most other, like, quote unquote works of art. I wondered if you had a specific take on that or thought about that.
Yeah, that's a pretty thoughtful question for a young guy.
Thank you.
I didn't when I was young, but I do now. Well, I certainly didn't mind putting the effort in, because I certainly was careful to make sure I designed buildings that would last. So,
right.
The functionality question, not just that it functioned to solve the aesthetic problems of living in it, but also that it had that endurance, right, so that it could survive. I thought about that, but basically, you're right. The clients were very wedded to the buildings I created, because I did fulfill their deepest inner thoughts of what they wanted. But people move on and people die and their lives change, and even though my clients would protect the creations, the people who came after were not wedded the same way. And I've seen a lot of buildings that I've done deteriorate, not just physically, but in terms of changes being made that the original client never. So even though they have a 50-year life that you can count on, they don't have a 100-year life that you can count on.
Right.
Yeah.
And I thought that was going to be really hard, but it's just inevitable. There's nothing you can do. I mean, if you thought, I needed to explain this, or I needed to, they're gone. Those people that built it are gone. These new people, they don't care. They don't care about whatever it was that happened.
Mm-hmm.
So it's tough. Sometimes the building has a certain resilience that it the next owner feels strongly about it, and I've had that happen on occasion. But it's not going to. Yeah, it's unfortunate, but it's not going to last forever.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's nice when you get like someone, like a new person that cares about the building.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really nice. I had a house that I did from scratch that the owners sold it, and then the next owner called me up and said, please come over and tell us what your vision is for this building. Yeah,
that's great.
But that only happened once.
Mm-hmm.
But then I've had owners that are, like the Stoica Miller house, where they're getting old, but they aren't going to move out. They aren't going to go to assisted living or else, because they want to be in that house right to the end.
Yeah.
And then, that's a good feeling too.
Yeah. But yeah, so that's all the questions. So now we just have like a few slides, and we can go through them quickly. So we'll just keep our commentary to the minimum for these that we're just going to go through, and then just anything that you want to add, feel free to add. And then that'll be about it. So yeah. All right. So first, we're going to talk about the different aspects.
I want to ask you while we're talking. This is the way I realized this coming in, that you do these long podcasts.
Yeah.
How come such a long format? I mean, that's quite a. I mean, what's the longest one?
Okay. So yeah. So in terms of the length of the live streams, the first live stream, we made it, we made all the slides, and we were like, okay, I think this will be like an hour. We were like, this will probably just take like an hour. Then it was like 2.5 hours, just because we kept talking and having good conversation. And it was just like kind of irresistible to keep going,
I think that's the heart of it, is the number one thing that we don't want to do is kind of like stunt a conversation. We want to have the fullest, richest conversation that we can. And it started off just me and Max, and both of us love to talk, and we can definitely fill our time.
Yeah.
But then we started bringing on guests that were very, very knowledgeable, like you are, about their respective fields or their respective interests, and we definitely don't want to dampen any of their thoughts because of just the passion they have behind the information that they're delivering. When we're doing strictly a more strictly educational stream, we don't want to leave things out that might lead people to think something that isn't true. We want to hit on everything, get the fullest picture of whatever we're talking about. And so yeah, it does run pretty long, and people usually don't stick around for the full length, or if they do, it's just on in the background, and that's completely fine, because as long as
people can watch it in parts too.
Exactly. As long as we don't harbor or as long as we don't dampen a conversation, as long as we capture the fullest essence of whatever we're talking about, then at least in my mind, we've done our duty.
Right.
Yeah, and then in terms of longest episodes, so I would say there's two. So there's one that was unorganically long, and there was one that was organically long. The one that was organically long was, I believe it was the elections episode, where it was like just, about a year ago almost now, where we, ahead of the 2020 election, we talked about every U.S. presidential election in history, and there are 59 of them. So We talked about all 59 of them, and it took like 4.5 hours or something like that.
I'll get you the exact length right now.
I think it was 4:26 or something like that. But then way earlier, like almost 2 years ago now, we did an episode that was intentionally long where we called it the all-nighter. And so we just did like 12 hours with our friends. It was kind of like having a sleepover online. So it was just like, we just, so that was just kind of, that was more of a fun one in terms of like the information that was coming. Like after a while, the information wasn't as great. I think the elections episode was one that was like long and full of information the whole way. But then in terms of just longest, that would be the all-nighter, which was like 12 hours. So, and that was just from the outset, we were like planning like, okay, we're going to do a 12-hour live stream. And that was when we were live streaming on Saturday nights, not Sunday nights, because, you know, it's a school night now. So, yeah.
Yeah, so season 5, it was almost 5 hours was this elections episode.
The election episode.
It was 4 hours and 50 minutes. We almost sat there for 5 hours. Yeah, go ahead.
And you prepared, the two of you prepared all that information.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Just like notes.
How long did that take?
That took a while too.
Yeah, it was mainly Max on that one, I will say. Credit where credit is due. Max, I remember you had like pages upon pages of notes
for each.
And all of that stuff. It was incredibly impressive. I gotta give like full credit to Max on that one.
I think it was the Wednesday before we had like pretty much a day off of school because of like some sort of like testing or something, some standardized test down here. So I had like Wednesday and I was just sort of like not doing much. So I'm like, okay, so I have time to prepare for this episode. That was a fun one, definitely.
But did you, how familiar had you become with your notes, your material? Did you have to read everything or did you remember some of that stuff?
So I did like a read through of like stuff online about each election, and then I took like sort of like bullet notes almost. I did probably like a paragraph, maybe like 3 to 4 sentences for each election, and then just anything from memory to add on top of that. So yeah, it was kind of like, since there's 59 elections, that's like it's kind of crazy. 59 elections in U.S. history. Even doing a stream that's 4 hours and 50 minutes long, that's still just an average of 5 minutes per election. So, So yeah, but yeah, that was fun.
And Sebastian, you could jump in. You could contribute to that conversation.
Oh yeah, I was able to follow it. It definitely, Max was definitely the leader on that episode. But it was fascinating to just kind of, go through history in like a significant amount of detail. Again, yeah, there might have only been like an average of 5 minutes per election, but we also in that episode looked at like overall trends, what ramifications any individual thing was. We speculated on what would have happened if something had gone a different way, like if someone else had won. I think we speculated on how different presidents would have responded to different situations, and a lot of stuff like that. So I was definitely able to throw my hat into the ring. I definitely wasn't able to be the leader on all that because I just didn't have all that that raw data that Max was able to collect, which was fantastic.
Yeah. And we definitely switch off sometimes on like who's going to be like doing more of the research, just depending on who knows more from the outset.
And the other can be like a straight man, like, well, that makes me wonder, and ask the questions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's often how we filled our time in the first couple of seasons when us having guests was pretty rare. That was pretty much our exact dynamic. Would be we took things that we were pretty knowledgeable about, and we the other person would be the one lobbing questions at the other, and that would spark dialogue, and then we would be like, oh, I think this, I'm wondering about all of this stuff, and before we know it, we had sat there for like 2.5 hours.
Yeah.
It never feels forced. I think that's the biggest thing about like that, in that we love to both to educate and also just to talk, because a lot of our friends, when our guests are when our friends are the guests on the podcast, they say that it just kind of feels like a conversation that we would like normally have, not in front of like an audience and stuff like that. So the conversation flows naturally, and before you know it, you have hours upon hours upon hours of content. I don't even know how many hours that must be now, but
oh yeah,
it feels great.
I feel a lot now.
I think you both have the endurance that you could do all-nighters as architecture students.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks. Oh man. But yeah, we don't want to keep you here for too long, so we'll just go over these quickly, because a lot of this stuff we already talked about a little bit. But the aspects of engineering, Sebastian and I sort of like isolated like 3 different important things involved in architecture in general. And so the first one was engineering that we talked about, and that is just sort of the base, like the structure needs to be stable, like the very most basic concern, before you can I don't know, it probably sort of flows together that like as you're thinking of like what kind of how you want it to look, at the same time you have to think about like how it's going to be built, and so it all sort of mixes together, I imagine. But this is just a very important aspect. Like here we have a few pictures. On the left we've got a support beam, which is just like if you think about it, you might not necessarily want a beam in the middle of the room there, but at a certain point it might become necessary. And especially if you haven't like planned as well as like maybe you could have, then you're going to end up with like sort of like hasty like fixes, like, oh, this needs to be fixed in the design, otherwise it's not going to work. And then you have just sort of engineering marvels like the Burj Khalifa, which is like 900 meters tall, and the Golden Gate Bridge, which also looks great. So that's sort of a fusion of just, the engineering can fit with the aesthetics too.
I'll comment. I mean, there, the engineering, the bridge is a good example that the engineering is somehow obvious and relevant in those kinds of bridge tunnel structures. The Burj Khalifa is certainly where engineering becomes critical, but there's not that many buildings like that. Though any tall building is certainly an engineering problem, but Burj Khalifa is at another level, where certainly the structure is probably there right from the beginning. There's some concept of how they're going to get that high. But that first illustration is one that's most relevant to most architecture, because in fact there's not that many ways to build buildings. And so I have a friend who teaches architecture, and he has a system, and I want to get this right. He basically gives a series of problems. We talked about how that's the way it's done. Mm-hmm. So the first problem is with bearing, okay? And he says, okay, in this problem, and he describes a problem, you're going to have to build something, solve it, with a building that's a bearing wall building. There's going to be walls. The walls are going to support the floors. The floors can only span 16 feet. So every 16 feet, there's got to be another wall. And you can make a hole in the wall for a doorway, but it can't be more than 6 feet wide. Okay? That's a bearing wall problem. And now, because you've phrased the problem that way, you make the student think about every way to solve it with that structure. Okay? Then he goes to what's he do next? Then he does a column grid. He says, okay, now, here's a new problem, and this building has to be built with a grid of columns. And the grid of columns, the columns can be anywhere from 16 feet to 24 feet apart. And they have to be in a grid. And, how do you solve that problem? And then they'll go to a combination of, walls and columns. You can use columns if you need them, and right? So there's a way to make the structure become part of the game, part of the formal game. If you get used to what each structure can do for you, then you suddenly are in a position where someone gives you a problem, and you say, oh, well, I'm going to do that with a bearing wall, or I'm going to do that with a column grid. So that's what I'd say about structure.
Cool. All right. Next up, we've got functionality. And so here we have some functionality fails, I guess you could say, and then also some functionality like masterpieces. And so on the left here, we have this short staircase that doesn't go anywhere, and it's like, what is that doing there? Then we've got a water fountain that is too small for the water that's coming out. And then we have like a drawer that opens into the dishwasher, these sort of issues. But then we have a good design, this is a like generic supermarket floor plan. And I've heard that like supermarkets, their floor plans are designed to like psychologically make you want to shop for a longer amount of time. So they are like masterfully designed with that in mind. So.
Yeah. So, in my world of architecture, it's all about the floor plan, and the floor plan I see as a way to solve functional problems. So sometimes some of the problems that, it's like now everything's on the computer, and the computer can show you the whole building anywhere you want to look, but when it's on a computer, you don't look everywhere. You don't look at that corner where you found it. And if you don't look at it, you don't know that there's not enough headroom there. But a floor plan is an abstraction. It brings the amount of information way, way down. It tells you everything you need to know. And so that's part of what I think of as solve function. What? I don't know. When you were talking about the supermarket, that's the problem the client gives for the architect to solve, but it's torture for the shopper.
Yeah.
They want you to go down every aisle and see everything they got, and you want to just go and get some milk. So
yeah.
So there's a conflict between the client and the client, because they're both in a way users. And it made me think of IKEA. I only went in an IKEA store once. I couldn't believe it. You walk in the front door and you got to go down this pathway. There's no choice, right? Is that what happened to you guys when you?
Oh, absolutely.
You got to go through the whole store.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, that's funny because there's actually sort of like an internet joke where it's like a story. It's part of this like broader, like it's like a horror, like internet horror stories. And it's called The Infinite IKEA, and it's like this like mythical sort of place where it's like a fictional fantasy thing where it's like it's an IKEA but it's infinitely large and you can get stuck there, which is just probably like the writers were just thinking of like, oh, last time I was at IKEA I got lost and it was just crazy, and so that's probably what they were drawing on. So that is pretty funny.
So I think we've touched on the moral aspects of the profession of architecture. Is it morally okay to design for your client who wants you to do this something that is absolutely cruel?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the way slaughterhouses are designed.
Yeah.
You come in and you go through until you're dead.
Yeah.
So I would never do that to a
Mhm.
user.
Yeah, exactly. But yes, that's the importance of functionality. It's like the human interaction with the building. And so then finally here we have aesthetics. And so on the left, I would say is an example of what I would consider bad aesthetics, because you have this like old building from I mean I can't tell when, but it's like an ancient building. It's a museum, and it looks like a natural history museum. So it's like an old style thing. And then right next to it, you've got another part of the museum that is like a sort of like very expressionist kind of building that's like sharpened like steel and glass, and the contrast just does not really work well together. And so then on the right is something that looks a bit better. And so aesthetics are important to consider when building something, just because it has to look good.
The most important thing to me on that subject is what that picture on the left is showing. It's this idea of contextualism. It really doesn't matter how beautiful the object is. It doesn't work with what's next to it, then it doesn't work. And that's what I think that illustrates. There's nothing wrong with the sculptural thing, but not there. It doesn't work there. And it sure doesn't work with the next sculptural thing that's on the other side, and then the next one, and then the next one. And once you do it once, then you're letting it happen over and over again. And you cannot make cities that way. You cannot.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's probably like you need to have a certain limit on the density of those kind of buildings, because it's almost like you need the more regular looking buildings around them to sort of like frame something that's more like to stand out a bit more, and it makes more of a statement, I would say, if you have sort of like other regular city buildings. But here it's just not even, because it's like the styles are completely off. But if this was in like a New York or something where the styles might fit, you still need to make sure that you don't have too many of them all together, because then it's just like
it's chaos.
Yeah. So
this question, because I taught for a couple of years as architecture, and so what's okay and what's not? It's a pretty complicated question. I'm not opposed to new ideas, right? So what am I opposed to? And I happened to be teaching in the United Arab Emirates, so I was in Dubai, and this was in 2005, 2006. So the city was just being built at that time. What you're talking about, having some sense of the city, of what the city is, so that the odd monuments can stand out. The term that's commonly used is the fabric of the city. The fabric is the uniform background in which the monuments sit, and it's an interesting question. What does it take to make fabric? Because it could be as simple as you can say, okay, in this city, you can make any shape you want, but it's always got to be the same color, right? So suddenly you can get crazy with shapes, but just having something that would make it all work together. You can do anything you want, but it can't be all glass. You can do anything you want, but the glass always has to be clear. You can't have blue and gold and orange glass. Something to give it contextualism and then create fabric.
Yeah,
Interesting.
I just came back from a decently long road trip through the South, and I noticed a decent amount of pretty interesting architectural things, especially with like the quote unquote fabric of different places. One of the places I visited was Chapel Hill, a town in North Carolina, and a large portion of that town is made of completely, like, solely red bricks. If not all of it. Like the streets are paved with red bricks, and the buildings are made with red bricks, and they're different, like, shapes and sizes to accommodate for what each individual location needs. But that's the thing that, like, ties everything together, and it made it. It's a very, very pretty town. Similarly to, I also got to visit New Orleans. The buildings there definitely have a very specific style. What I noticed the most is probably with ironwork. There's a lot of ironwork in New Orleans, and the specific pattern that's being repeated on the iron bars obviously differed from building to building, but the fact that there still was, black iron hanging off of each of these buildings, it tied it together, and I really enjoyed that city.
Those are perfect examples, and they show how wide the range is of things that can create fabric. That it can go from the brick to the wrought iron decoration. There's a million ways to do it, but you got to do it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, because otherwise you can end up with something that just looks like 50 islands that have, like, somehow tectonically, like, smashed together. So.
But you made me think of something else, because I think about it. I think I started thinking about it when I was in New York City relatively recently, and the Freedom Tower, was built to replace the World Trade Center, and it's very tall, and it's all glass, steel and glass, and it's really kind of handsome. It's a stunning building, but it has no context. Everything around it is just, mostly innocuous steel and glass building. And it occurred to me that I like the Freedom Tower, but other than that, I've never seen a steel and glass building that I liked, period. I don't think you can make steel. I don't think you can make cities out of steel and glass. If the Freedom Tower was surrounded by buildings that were all masonry, like New York used to be, it would be unbelievable. It would be wonderful. But surrounded by more steel and glass that's reflecting so many things that you can't even see it, it just...
Yeah.
It's lost. Solely lost. So, I couldn't believe that I had an opinion that was that simplistic. But I really can't think of a steel and glass building that I like.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about.
Yeah. It's sort of, I would say, it's like sort of unnatural almost, is kind of the feel, and I feel like psychologically, like, we're more familiar with, like humans have been building with wood and, like, stone for, like, tens of thousands of years, and steel and glass, like, have only existed for hundreds of years, so it's kind of like there's got to be a more, like, almost careful and more precise thought process when building something out of steel and glass, because it's not going to be as generally like appealing as something that's wooden or stone. So that would be my theory on that.
Yeah, and I don't know that humans will ever come really, because we don't change as a species very quickly.
Yeah.
I remember when I was photographing the Freedom Tower, I went and I found a masonry building that was near it, and photographed it looming up above the masonry buildings in the foreground, and it looked fantastic. And it is steel and glass, and that's one building I like, but only because it was in my photograph surrounded by masonry building, and I could I was thinking I could use this in a lecture,
Right.
because this proves my point. I know anyone who looks at this is going to like it better than in this other photograph where it's surrounded by just other steel and glass things that don't create. What the problem with steel and glass is it doesn't create form, so it can't make space. It doesn't create a wall in which that encloses. It's just it's not form. It's not space. It lacks everything that a Trani has, for example.
Yeah. But yeah, so that actually gets into different styles of architecture, and we're just going to go through these and just see what we think about them. So yeah. So first of all, we have Gothic architecture. So Sebastian, do you want to talk about this one?
So Gothic architecture was, around late 12th to about 16th century, mainly centralized in Europe, and it's characterized by a lot of intricacy, which I love. That's another reason why I love the Southeast Asian architecture, because it's very, very intricate. But you see a lot of arches, a lot of turrets, I believe is the correct name for it, like the towers that are around it, as well as the specific stones that it's cut from. There are usually specific stones that are used in it. I mean, when I look at this, I think about vampires. I don't know about anyone else, but that is what I think about when I look at that. It's beautiful. It is absolutely beautiful in kind of a dark way. It's associated with a lot of quote unquote like dark academia, like black magic, stuff like that. So a lot of supernatural stereotypes, I guess, around the architecture, and I think that's really cool. That just a certain architectural style can get you thinking, oh, vampires, supernatural, like the occult, all that kind of stuff, just because of the way a building is shaped and all of that. But this definitely stuck around for a while. Like I said, late 12th to like mid 16th century, and I don't think any of it is really going on today in any large capacity. Like there was that job that we talked about before we went on stream, where they wanted that specific house to look like something from Transylvania, that you worked on, specifically towards like the witches and all that kind of stuff. But I don't think any real like quote unquote Gothic architecture is going on large scale anywhere, other than maybe like refurbishings of already existing Gothic architectures. But I think it's a very, very interesting style, and absolutely one of the most striking architectural styles that we have from history.
Yeah,
I think there might be a cathedral in Spain that's under construction. But yeah,
that's La Sagrada Familia by Gaudi. That they're still building. I agree. It's an incredible. I don't think people often stop and think about it long enough to realize how incredible those Gothic cathedrals are. At the time, they were like the Mission to Mars.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they were doing things that had never been done before, and that were took generations to realize, and were the limit of what was possible to do with stone. They were truly incredible. But to keep the structure of the story, of my story, they only worked because the whole city had a uniform fabric, and they were the only monument in typically the only one in any given city. Maybe two, or maybe a town hall might be in the Gothic style. But around that was all this very uniform and simpler architecture that made these things stand out. And there's an illustration of from the 18th century or something, where somebody said, the utopian Gothic city, and they drew this city with all cathedrals. It doesn't work. It doesn't work, and that's what we're doing now.
Yeah.
So the Gothic cathedrals are incredible, but that is not a reason to make every building into a Gothic cathedral.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think that in their time, some Gothic architecture was actually like the tallest buildings in the world. I think it was after the pyramids of Egypt, which were the tallest for like thousands of years. Then it was a Gothic cathedral. And so it's really like a Burj Khalifa of this time period. So
absolutely. And the to go up in those towers, which you could do, and look down on the city, was as close to flying as you could be in the medieval time.
But yeah, so next up we've got Tudor. And so this is based on the reign of several kings in England in the Tudor family. And this sort of house, like, you really think like English countryside, like that's just immediately like what it makes me think of, like sunny, bright, like English countryside, like Charles Darwin's house or something like that. So
I don't know much about Tudor, but yeah, I always loved it. There's Tudor houses in Fairfield, Connecticut.
Absolutely.
Right, and they look lovely. But what you'd say there is that the Gothic cathedrals were an art form created by what can I do with stone? Mm-hmm. How do I take stone to the limit? Tudors, how do I take wood to the limit? It's an expression, an aesthetic that comes from the desire to build with wood in a beautiful way. So, the structure can inform aesthetics. And it was wood that was informing the aesthetics of the Tudor.
That's a really good point about taking a certain material to its limits, because having like mastery over a certain medium like stone or like wood would allow you to kind of envision, so I'm able to do X, Y, and Z with wood, and it allows you to kind of play to whatever specific building material. It allows you to play to its strengths. Like that's why the Gothic architecture looks so different from the Tudor architecture, because with stone you can stack it and you can make it into all of these arches and towers and stuff like that. And with wood, you can make these, reasonably complex structures and have them, be quaint, for lack of a better word, and stuff. But it's playing towards each material's strength, and I really like to see that.
Yeah. The Gothic arch, that pointed arch, that's because the round arch is less stable than that pointed arch.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one of the key aesthetics of Gothic, but it's pragmatic, it's structural.
So that's
all
Tudor.
Right. Yeah. All right. So next we've got Victorian, and so this is Queen Victoria, again in England. Now this is like, it makes me think like sort of suburban, like New England almost, like, although like where we lived, Fairfield doesn't quite look like this, but I would say there's probably some suburbs like more like closer to New York City, I think, that look a bit more like this, with this style.
Yeah, Victorian is pretty it's San Francisco. That's famous for Victorian style wood and architecture. This is all about these questions of style versus something more deep. The Gothic buildings, you could talk about, because of the stone, that there was floor plans there that can only be built with stone, but that informed a kind of floor, a kind of way of space with the rows of columns and naves and cloisters, and Tudor and Victorian don't have that deeper meaning. They're just the style.
Yeah.
You know, so it's a little harder for me to talk about them. I've never studied Tudor floor plan.
Mm-hmm.
I've never studied Victorian floor plan because they're going to be like any other floor plan.
Right.
There's
Yeah.
no invention going on that deeper level.
Because you could imagine taking a house that has like, you could imagine taking a Victorian house, looking at its floor plan, and then like turning it into something else, and like that would probably be easier to do than like a Gothic.
Yes, you could, and the Tudor and Victorian are the example. You can take any Tudor house and turn it into a Victorian house without changing the floor plan at all, and you can, or vice versa, and that's what I'm speaking about. Not that it's a criticism. Tudor houses are beautiful, and the Victorian houses are beautiful, but it's just a style, and I'm not that interested in style. You know what that reminds me of? There's a lot going on today that's just a style. So the floor plans in modern buildings, especially high-rise condos, apartment buildings, they're all the same. There's no invention at all on the level. They're all that's going on is interior decoration, and so it's all about the countertop or the brand of stove. That's all that's happening because there ain't anything else.
Yeah.
Right. Because all the floor plans are the same. So there's no invention there in my sense of what architecture is about. And that's the Victorian, the Tudor, it wasn't interior decoration, it's exterior decoration. But it was just decoration.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, next up we have like Southern style wraparound porch, like banners like this, and on the right that's Forrest Gump. That's the house from that movie. So, yeah.
There's a little bit of there's some floor plan concept going on there because it has to do with cooling the house and having every room have windows on two sides, having the big verandas that were open and airy, and that shaded the walls of the house from. There's something there pragmatic there that you can use to design a nice house in the southern climate now.
Yeah,
so it's not just decoration.
Yeah, exactly. Because like now we have air conditioning, so it's like you can kind of have whatever house you want. But like back in time, like I think 100 years ago, there really wasn't air conditioning, and so you had to build structures that could stay cool, or else it'd be like uninhabitable almost, these parts of the country.
And that's again going back to the idea of what many people might see as like a stylistic choice, or it's a trademark of a certain type of architecture actually being a functional thing, like a choice done for functionality purposes, like for like air venting, air conditioning, stuff like that.
Well, and it's always a mix. Mm-hmm. So the examples that we've gone through, Gothic is both functional and aesthetic to an incredible degree. I mean, really to a stunning degree. There's nothing anywhere in a Gothic building that's not totally functional. Mm-hmm. You change anything, it's going to fall down. And the Southern mansion is a mix. There's an aesthetic there too, but it's based on function. But the Tudor and the Victorian are much more aesthetic and much less functional. And that's why one of the biggest shortcomings of architecture is and this not to criticize what we're doing right now, but it's not about style, and most people think that it is. I can go to Atrani and create the most modern city that's ever been conceived by man by drawing on ancient Atrani. Um, um, but that's not about style. It's never about style. There's always deeper lessons that have to do with understanding things in plan that are timeless. And if you learn all of them from all the different times, then you have the deepest vocabulary of being able to create buildings. And it's based on floor plans and all the variations on through and all the functionalities that they've achieved. But it's not about style. It's not. So now you see new architects trying to come up with a new style, and doomed to failure on the level that I judge. Because just because it's new doesn't mean it's good.
Yeah, that makes sense. But yeah. So next up we have brutalism.
Next style.
Yeah. I don't like this one that much. So this
I like
brutalism,
this examples you picked for brutalism. I saw them earlier. I can't see them now. But Boston City Hall, that's a perfect, that's a classic example of brutalism.
Yeah. So so these structures. Oh yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
What's the other picture?
Let me. I'll have to find it again. But brutalism.
Aren't they up there? Are we looking at them now?
Yeah, the pictures are up there. It's just okay. So this one, the one on the left is the Archivo Personal Julian Varas. So I don't know. It's like just.
Yeah, I don't know that building, but I thought it was a good example too.
Yeah, but yeah, so brutalism is sort of this like utilitarian style, just considering like sort of like functionality, kind of like packing things in as tight as possible. And it was a style that was popular like sort of in the 50s and 60s of like, let's try and make things that like are really efficient. Like it's sort of about efficiency, but then it sacrifices kind of a lot of the aesthetic concerns. And so you'll see like a lot of American like jails and schools are made like this, as well as like I think a lot of Soviet cities, like I think Yakutsk, the one that's like in the middle of nowhere, that was built just because it's like, okay, we need a city here, and so it was built like this. But yeah, I don't know. It would be a depressing style to live in. I feel it might be interesting to take a look at every once in a while, but it's just too much. It's like giant parking garages almost.
Well, all right. So I'll make a confession. When I was an architecture student, that Boston City Hall, I don't know. Can we describe? Is it on the right in this pairing of?
Yeah.
Yeah. It intrigued me as a young architect. I don't know why. It was just like such a wild thing. It was so bizarre and complex. It was to me, it was like a science fiction thing.
Some of these can be good, I'll admit. It's more the one on the left is what I'm talking about in terms of how it's done poorly. But
again, the Boston City Hall was the city hall, and for a while it sat in the middle of Boston. Boston had an incredible sense of fabric and uniformity, and so it was the monument, just like the Gothic cathedral would have been in Europe. So it worked as an odd piece that it became a special spot. But you can't make a city out of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that's the same sort of problem, is that it might work fine individually as a few buildings, but then when you try to make something like a fabric out of that, you can't, because it's not like sort of goes against like human psychology. But yeah.
You know what is fascinating about like a Trani is that well, there's a church there, but the whole thing is just fabric. That's just worth contemplating. That you
Yeah.
know, oh, you know what it is. Now this is interesting. See, the buildings are just fabric. There are no monumental buildings. Same in the Paolo Soleri megastructure. It's all fabric, but the whole thing is a monument. So instead of it being 1,000 monuments to make a city, it's 1,000 pieces of fabric to make one monument. That's right, and that's the key.
That's why it works.
That's
so
what
well.
makes it work.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know, there's a concept. You know, if I was teaching the class now, I'd say, there you go. You know, get your heads around that, because no one's ever done that. Well, they used to, but not in the last 200 years.
Yeah. Yeah. So next up we have metropolitan. So this is the sort of like city, like New York City or Dubai, or we have like London and Shanghai here. And so this is like the steel and glass kind of thing, which is like, it's interesting because I would say one thing that's sort of a little weird is that as you look at a lot of city skylines, like all the cities that use this kind of architecture, if you were to just sort of flip through them for a while, eventually it starts to sort of blur together. And it would actually be hard, I feel, to recognize, like to sort of distinguish one metropolitan looking city from another. And so like here we have like very famous cities, but I feel like it would sort of, it's kind of hard to tell because it's, I don't know, it's all like really similar looking.
Yeah, I think that's the important point. How'd you come up with the term metropolitan to describe it?
So I don't know if there's a better term. I just said this title was originally, I just said New York City style, and I'm like, okay, I need to think of something better than that. So right. I said metropolitan.
Right. So I mean, I think that there is no style to contemporary cities. There is no concept for them. Mm-hmm. What makes them so uniform is that all the pieces are these expressionist pieces that have no contextual value and no fabric value. So what we're seeing is cities that are accumulations of expressionist buildings. Mm-hmm. And it scares me. There are views I've seen of Manhattan that I cannot recognize that it's Manhattan.
Yeah.
I don't have any idea where it is.
Yeah, that's the problem. You know, it's like this could be on any continent. You know, it's like.
Right. So that means there is no Manhattan. There is no Paris. Well, Paris is, fortunately, the French don't do that. They aren't going to ruin Paris. But it's amazing how unidentifiable cities are becoming. And it's a horrible loss of context, of place.
Yeah.
All right. So now this is with like houses. We've got modern style houses. So this is the sort of like basic shapes kind of thing, where it's like sort of removes some of the like texture of like having like wood grain or something like that. It's like sort of like angular, like polygons almost. It's sort of interesting, like almost like a video game design kind of a house, like sort of an interesting style.
What I'd say, modern is exactly what it is. That's the way that style is described. And it was a movement that happened in the 1920s, roughly, where they decided to consciously rebel against style. The idea of style. No more Tudor, no more Victorian. These, were right before them. We're going to do something that has no style. So what happens when you remove style entirely and it's just function? And I hated modernism when I was a student. Because it was cold and it didn't appeal to me. But boy, we were taught to design in that way, and it taught me the basics of architecture, because without style, I had to look at the floor plan and I had to think about how the floor plan was organized, and it was a good training ground, because the floor plans become all there is to think about in a modern building. And I found that they could take you anywhere you want to go in terms of style, if you really got good at those floor plans.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. So just like you could also turn a modern style house into, a Victorian or a Tudor.
Absolutely. Yeah. Only it would be a good Victorian, because it would have a good floor plan, right?
Yeah.
The floor plans had to be good in those buildings. They really, that's all there was. They were appealing to the functionality of the whole thing. So,
yeah.
And they explored the whole idea of bearing wall versus column, that kind of idea, and the combination of and curving walls. They started to explore what that meant.
All right. So the last two styles, I think Sebastian knows a bit more about. So yeah, take it away.
So next up, we have the more Islamic style that you would see in the Middle East, where the religion of Islam is more prominent. Examples usually of this include the domes on top of buildings, a lot of domes, a lot of white, I think marble architecture, as well as decently intricate patterns on the walls and on the floor, in some of the examples that you can see here that we have up. I really like all this stuff. I really love the pattern work. I think it is some of the best pattern work I've ever seen. Incredibly intricate, and what's really the most fascinating thing about this to me is where they are able to fit in the patterns. I've never really seen it done in any other form of architecture, because they find places to put in patterns that you wouldn't normally think about. Like, on the left, we have one of numerous arches, and there is a pattern put on the at the crest of the arch, and then a different pattern going down the columns that are holding up the arch. And if you look at the one on the bottom right, you have patterns adorning the top of the domes and stuff like that. So finding in places to squeeze in all of these really intricate patterns, it really makes it appealing to the eye for me. And I think it's definitely striking and easily recognizable. Yeah, that's what I have to say about that.
I actually decided it was about time I pull up the images that you're showing, because I wanted to see what you picked for Islam. What I would say about that that's interesting is it's a lot like it should be compared to Gothic, in that it's a style of building with masonry that's derived from the structure of what you can do with masonry, but with a whole different resultant style, which is kind of nice. That even though they're both derived from masonry structure, they came up with two totally different sets of forms.
Yeah.
And nice examples.
Thank you. Yeah, I really love looking at this type of stuff. Again, I have not traveled nearly as much as I want to, and looking at places such as like Istanbul, other places in the Middle East with this kind of architecture, I would love to check out.
What it reminds me of, again, looking at these images, there's a there's a there's a two there's two opposite qualities that architecture can have that have nothing to do with style, that go across style, and one is picturesque. Okay, like let me just look at this again. Yeah, I mean, all the examples you gave of Islamic architecture are here. The three examples, they're all picturesque. Picturesque is anything that is Victorian is picturesque. Gothic is picturesque. It's complex. It's got a very complicated silhouette. It has many multiple forms. It has asymmetry. Those are qualities that appeal to people on a gut level, like Max was talking about earlier, that are, and probably things that appeal to us because of nature and living in the forest and wanting to be in the midst of complexity and multiple colors and patterns. That's all picturesque. And on the other end is, and I'm trying to think what a good word is. I don't know. I mean, typically we use modern, clean, or pared down. But I had a professor who he didn't coin, he used two classical terms. He called picturesque, he said the right word is Dionysian, nature loving. And the right word for the opposite is Apollonian, from Apollo, the purity of the mind in mathematics. And that it's much more useful than thinking in terms of style to separate architecture into the Dionysian and the Apollonian. So Gothic, Tudor, Victorian, Islamic, all Dionysian, modern, brutalist, I don't know which of the others, all Apollonian.
That's a really cool distinction between the two.
Yeah,
I think those are really good names.
And I've found it in terms of my clients that there are personalities that just like one or the other, and it's got nothing to do with what's in style. That's what they like. Yeah.
So then I guess we can go on to what I believe is the last one, which is definitely very Dionysian, to use the proper term.
Yes.
Love of nature. And again, this is my favorite architecture, like, probably on the planet. I absolutely love the look of it, the stone that it's cut from, the way it interacts with nature, the intricacy of it. Like, for example, the picture on the right, all of those intricate statues. It's incredible to look at. Often when I am, in nature, I like to feel immersed in it. I often say that I like to feel small when I'm in nature, that I'm just kind of like a part of it, and I'm not like standing out in any way. I'm just like immersed in it. And this is some of the most immersive architecture I've ever seen. Just with the one on the left, just how absolutely massive that is. I'm pretty sure that is a real place. And if that's not a real place, there are definitely places very similar to that. For example, in Laos, Thailand, all Southeast Asia, Southeast Asian countries. Places like that make you feel both immersed in nature and immersed in the architecture. And that's what I love about it. The massive statues of the Buddha that are around that area are... I love them just because of just how massive they are. Just, as a note to the sculpture, but also as a note to the architecture that the sculptures might be sitting on. It's just, it's really cool to me just to see all of these feats that we can do in terms of architecture to immerse the viewer or like the user in a specific culture and a specific mindset. For example, obviously the Buddhist architecture to be associated with the Buddhist mindset and the lifestyle, or whatever purposes these might serve, probably religious or whatever the case might be. It absolutely works to immerse the user, and I think that's, one of the best things that architecture can do.
I like that description, and so I'm thinking, why does it affect you so well, so positively?
Mm-hmm.
And here's what I come up with. The thing that makes me nuts about architecture today is that these large buildings that are expressionists, so they're sculptures.
Mm-hmm.
The whole building is an abstract sculpture. That doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Because what works is what Sebastian is pointing to here, which is that there's the sculpture is on the architecture. The architecture isn't the sculpture. There's a combination of architecture and sculpture. So in this Far Eastern architecture, the sculpture covers the whole thing. But if you took all the sculpture away, the form beneath it is very Apollonian, right? It's very simple shape, right? And so you don't try. It's a mistake to try to make a building into a sculpture. The way to make better buildings is to combine buildings with sculpture. Right? And the Far Eastern architecture is an excellent example of doing that to an extreme. It is very powerful.
I would absolutely agree. And yeah, that's probably a big reason why I love this architecture so much. And I definitely was not letting us get away with an architecture stream without talking about it. And I'm glad we can close on that. So if we don't have anything else on this, we could hop on over to final thoughts.
Yeah, so this is just our concluding statements. Any last thoughts that want to be said? So yeah, I've really enjoyed this episode. Architecture, I think, is just really cool. I like all the different fields of creativity and mediums of creativity, and architecture is such a great one because it allows you to build massive scale structures. And I just mean even just a house is massive compared to other creative works. And there's also a beauty in serving a purpose. While aesthetics and functionality could be considered two different aspects in consideration of architecture, I think it's actually best when aesthetics and functionality are together, because it really, and even to bring in just engineering and physical constraints in, I just think all work together really well. That picture of the Golden Gate Bridge we had earlier, that is a good looking picture. And just the structure looks amazing. So architecture is really inspiring.
I'm just going back to that picture of the bridge. Yeah.
It's great.
You know what I've always loved about that bridge too? Is that it's red.
Yeah.
Right? The Eiffel Tower is red too. I think people miss that it was a good choice in color.
Yeah, I mean, it's just also, I think what is especially great about this picture is that it's taken at sunset or sunrise, and so the red color totally fits with that time of day. And so it just looks amazing. It almost looks like it's part, I imagine if you were far away, it would almost look like part of the horizon of the sun rising or setting.
Yeah, I love that. I really do love all the aesthetic value that that the bridge brings to that area. My parents lived in San Francisco, or at least around San Francisco, for around 8 years. So, and I've been there a couple of times. I was born there, but I was way too young to appreciate the aesthetic values of the Golden Gate Bridge. But upon returning back there, I wasn't lucky enough to see a sunrise or a sunset that was being complimented by the bridge, but I could definitely imagine my parents have definitely gone on and on about the architecture about that, and they're not big like architecture people, but it's definitely a view that you can't miss. It's definitely a great vista to look at.
Well, I'll wrap up by saying that I'm obviously fading away on the screen here. And I hadn't thought about that when I started because I didn't know you did marathons.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, we're sorry for dragging you along this long.
Yeah.
I hope it's more tolerable
but, yeah.
than architecture, like long architecture nights.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the sun is setting here, so. But yeah, you know what I'd like to say to wrap up? Talking with you guys gives me faith in the next generation. You know.
I'm really glad.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, more so than mine. That's for sure. One of the questions you had asked that we didn't get to, or I ignored. Are there any architects that I admire that are practicing now? And there is one guy. If people want to look him up, he's Glenn Murcutt. But not many. I don't admire what's going on in the world of architecture, But talking with the two of you makes me feel like the sense of what's valuable and what could happen in the future. It's right there. You guys have got it. That makes me hope that maybe things will get better.
Thank you.
I'm really glad that we can give you that hope.
Yeah.
We're going to do our best.
Definitely.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah. So. Oh yeah. Go ahead.
I'm gonna because it's ridiculous for my screen to go dark here.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna sign off. Can I do that?
All right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We're just about to leave anyway. So yeah, thank you for coming. Thank you for talking about architecture with us and sharing all your knowledge. Yeah.
Oh, it was definitely my pleasure. I enjoyed it. I really did. I'm glad I had my coffee with me, but it worked out perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye. But yeah, so with that being said, to everyone watching, thank you for watching. And thank you to Sebastian for being my co-host as always.
As always.
And we'll see you all next week. So yeah. All right then. Bye-bye.